Alrighty, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Here we are. Sorry, everybody, just a little glitch, but alhamdulillah, we got everything under control. Am I right, Noura? Did things get under control?
Yes, that's much better. Jazakallah khair.
Better. All right.
I think
So,
so. I
all
don't
right.
think any of the students were misbehaving. So
Good job, good job, good job. I knew that they would be good. I knew they would be good. Okay, so let us start. Of course, last time we did different hadith. Of course, it was really relating to multiple topics, but um, but um, I think, I mean, that has the pros and cons. The pros is that kind of gives you the ability to talk about various topics, and the cons, sometimes you can really get into topics that are probably way off. But inshallah, the hadith and their numbering will kind of give you an idea of what we're talking about. So last time we did this hadith عن عبد الله بن عمر بن الخطاب رضي الله عنهما عن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم من جر ثوبه خيلاء لم ينظر الله إليه يوم القيامة. Whoever would drag their garment in arrogance, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would not look at them on Judgment Day. We went in details in that regards, and we said it's not necessarily dragging it in length or dragging it because it's too long, but it could also be any type of a garment that a person is wearing to somehow stand out, which is thawb shuhra, or to somehow, I guess, try to boast about perhaps social status, financial status, or whatever it is, to stand out from the rest of the crew or the rest of the people, just to, of course, reflect arrogance and definitely belittling others by dressing in that way. Now, here's a question someone might ask. Well, what if this person is standing out with their garment to basically show profession? So you would have, for example, certain doctors might be wearing a white, the white garment, and the nurses would probably, be wearing maybe the scrubs in a certain color, and the rest of probably medical assistants or whatever it is are wearing a different color. What if we're speaking about such garments to, I guess, reveal the position, the job, and what each one is supposed to be doing? That's not impermissible. So when we're speaking about doing these classifications to help manage the field, for example, or help manage within the society, this is permissible. Here's another question that usually, and right now, I don't know why, but recently I've been getting a lot of women reach out to me, bringing in and coming in with these misconceptions. So misconceptions about marriage and women in Islam and all these different things. I would always recommend, if you want to learn Islam, please learn it from its resources and not from Orientalists and what they would write, or even the secular, let's say, ex-Muslims that were writing about Islam, that those people are not specialized in Islam. And if you wanted to learn about Islam, please go back to its resources. Please take the time, instead of coming over and just throwing a bunch of misconceptions and expecting a private session for every single questions or every single set of questions that you had. I would always recommend take the time to learn your Islam instead of trying to find some kind of a specialist to answer these one-on-one set of questions, because definitely I would say most of the questions are actually coming from misconceptions and probably lacking the resources. Why am I even talking about this? Because I would hear a lot of different people telling me, well, did the Muslims have the Jews wear certain garments to stand out from the rest of the people? Two answers to this one. Number one is that the Jews, the Christians, Ahl al-Kitab in general did distinguish themselves with their own garments anyways. Number two, same thing when we're speaking about slaves, they did actually stand out in a certain garment that they would wear. Slave women did not wear hijab. Within the Muslim governance, they didn't wear a complete hijab, but they wore, definitely it's modest, but not necessarily the same level of covering as other women. So what was the purpose for that? The purpose for that was to let other people recognize their boundaries, because there are certain boundaries that were definitely not allowed to transgress for people that are free people compared to people that are going through riq. So it was a completely different dynamic, I guess that's one thing. Number two, Jews and Christians, so you would know you had certain responsibilities towards certain citizens, certain rights, etc. So they chose to stand out, and even the Muslims were comfortable within the society to basically create such distinction. The distinction doesn't necessarily mean it's necessarily too obvious. They definitely wore certain garments, but it was not necessarily mandated by the Muslims. There are some reports that had basically mentioned that the Jews at one point were ordered to dress in yellow or dress wearing a certain star, etc. That was not necessarily an Islamic order, and that was more of an individual practice by certain phonetic khalifas, and not something that was even accepted by the scholars. And there is a scholar, his name is Salah Abdel Fattah al-Khalidi, who did a great research in regards to where and what this is coming from and where this is coming from and what resources are basically saying that the scholars that had rejected such a practice, that it wasn't coming from Islam, but it was coming from an individual phonetic practice and not necessarily from an Islamic standpoint. So Salah Abdel Fattah al-Khadi, just wanted to mention him. Okay, and of course, writing about that. And inshallah, if does this differ with women? What are we talking about, Nora? Okay, so just wanted to mention this one when we're speaking about a garment to express arrogance. That's the whole idea. So whether,
okay. Jazakallah khair.
right, so whether this is probably wearing a certain name brand, maybe even wearing, I've seen people wear clothes with name brands plus the tag on it, just to show that this is still brand new. And
Are you serious?
I know this is so silly and this is so stupid, but yes, this is real. They would still have the tag on it to show that it's still brand new, was capable of affording this, and it's definitely khuyala. Okay, عن أبي سعيد الخدري رضي الله عنه قال سمعت رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يقول من رأى منكم منكرا فليغيره بيده فإن لم يستطع فبلسانه فإن لم يستطع فبقلبه وذلك أضعف الإيمان. Whoever sees any wrongdoing, then they would have to attempt to change it with their hand, which basically here is a metaphor to basically refer to power. Okay, that's if the person had the power to remove that, to change that, then that's what should be as the priority and is the first way to make sure that they are changing it if they have the power to do so. فَإِن لَمْ يَسْتَطِعْ فَبِلِسَانِهِ. If they're not capable of doing so, then do it with their tongue, i.e., do it verbally, do it orally, and whether it's through media, whether it's through social media, maybe a post on Facebook, maybe a word of mouth, but at the end, do what you can to speak out against this evil thing that is out there. Number two, فَإِن لَمْ يَسْتَطِعْ فَبِقَلْبِهِ وَذَلِكَ أَضْعَفُ الْإِيمَانِ. And if they're not capable of doing so, then do so the least with your heart. In other words, to recognize that this is not right, to recognize that you yourself don't fall in it, to not normalize it, and certainly to recognize on the inside that you want to isolate and distance yourself away from this wrongdoing. وَذَلِكَ أَضْعَفُ الْإِيمَانِ. So the scholars actually had differences of opinions on whether وَذَلِكَ أَضْعَفُ الْإِيمَانِ, if we're talking about فَإِن لَمْ يَسْتَطِعْ فَبِقَلْبِهِ, meaning that this is going to harm the person's faith negatively, so it's going to reduce the person's iman if that's the least level that they could do. That's the first interpretation. The second interpretation, فَإِن لَمْ يَسْتَطِعْ فَبِقَلْبِهِ وَذَلِكَ أَضْعَفُ الْإِيمَانِ, it's not that it harms the person's faith, but it's describing that this is the least of faith, and this is the least of what a person of faith could be doing. But the question is, when do I go from this step to this step? Two things. Number one, if you are fearful that if you would speak out, perhaps in power, and let's say come out there and enforce what is right, and probably forbid what is wrong, that you might, endanger yourself, you might put your family at risk, you might put your health at risk, etc. So you basically would fear that you might put yourself in a dangerous situation or your family, then you would go to step two. The second reason why one may go from here to here is that if you were to probably use this method of power to enforce what is right and forbid what is wrong, that it might lead to a bigger harm. Either the people basically rejecting it, or perhaps the people might even go into kufr. So in that situation, you're going to go to step two, which is using your tongue. I would like to mention here, when we're speaking about changing in power and how do we understand this point, just remember that the Prophet ﷺ himself, just keep this one in mind, he did not demolish the idols, which is considered definitely a symbol of shirk. But the Prophet ﷺ, even though he was in Mecca, but there was not a single time that he had demolished any idol whatsoever. And it wasn't until he continued to work on this da'wah with his tongue, with the Quran, with speaking to the people. And it wasn't until the 8th, 9th, 10th Hijriya did the Prophet ﷺ order the complete demolish of all the idols. Not to mention that the Prophet ﷺ didn't even do Hajj, even though Mecca was conquered in the 8th year Hijrah, but the Prophet ﷺ didn't do Hajj till the 10th. And the main reason why he didn't do Hajj till the 10th, so it took 2 years, it would take just a couple days to demolish the 360 something idols from around the Kaaba. But there was something even, other than the idols that were there. It was the common practice that people would rotate around the Kaaba immodestly. Let's just the least describe it as, was immodestly, and the Prophet ﷺ did not want to be present while there were still people going around the Kaaba in an immodest way, still performing some of their shirk, definitely. So just wanted to note that one before we would go to enforcing and using force in making sure that people are practicing what is right and what is wrong. taking the inspiration from the Prophet ﷺ and making sure that we have the medium to have the people remove the jahiliyyah, remove the shirk by us probably getting in maybe the specialists. Let's look at Syria. Many, of course, you had Hizb ut-Tahrir, you had ISIS, you had a lot of different people say, hey, announce it as Khilafah, and they'll come up right there. And another group would say, hey, right now you need to apply the hudud, and they're just really jumping onto later and a way farther step and not recognizing that the society had normalized the secular ideologies and had been living for 50 plus years under this regime. So you want to make sure that you give the people the chance to first absorb Islam, to first, it's not that they're not living Islam, but before you start putting in all these sets and all these sets of rules, it's very important to give people the freedom first to recognize the da'wah that they did not have the freedom to listen to properly. You just want to keep that one in mind. I'm not saying Syrians are not Muslim. Of course, 80+% are actually Muslim, but I'm not just talking about Syria. I'm talking about the rest of the area. Before we would just say, well, let's apply Sharia right there and start making it from day one. It's important to recognize the hikmah. In fact, the Prophet ﷺ himself, he told the Sayyidah Aisha, if it wasn't that because your people, speaking about the people of Quraysh, if the first things that were revealed in the Quran, do not steal, do not commit zina, do not drink, and you would have seen the opposition, that people will not leave that and consider that, no, you're trying to change our lifestyle, etc. But the Prophet ﷺ explained that the first things that were revealed in the Quran were ayatun min al-mufassal. They were ayat min al-mufassal, meaning ayat that were bringing in the foundations of aqidah in place. And that's when, after the aqidah was enhanced within their hearts, that's when they too were ready to make a change in practice. So this is important, to be wise, to take the inspiration from the Prophet ﷺ, to take and learn that when you want to change a society, it's not wise to just rush in taking away a lot of probably different cultures that they were practicing and rushing to making it that way, but it's an issue of changing it from within. But later on, there's definitely going to be a point where, even if people still desire that, they still do not want such a practice, there is a point where, certainly, like any other government on earth, even in America, you would have certain laws that might contradict perhaps people's freedoms and their choice of consent and all of that, but still the government would consider that certain practices are outside of the perimeter of individual freedom and considered that it contradicted and opposed people's security, or opposed perhaps culture, or opposed certain, of course, definitions of what they would call freedom, and or what they would consider as a human consenting to something, or whatever it is. And then the government would still use the power to say, well, this is illegal, we're going to allow this, we're not going to allow this, even though, of course, individual freedom is raised as a motto, as an emblem that they would definitely use and sing in their national anthem, but they would recognize that in practice, it's not necessarily always the case. So just wanted to mention this one. فَإِن لَمْ يَسْتَطِعْ فَبِلِسَانِهِ. If you're not capable of doing so, then do it with your tongue. So in this, of course, the tongue, whether you're doing da'wah, whether you are debating, whether you are perhaps doing individual da'wah, or whether it is an organization or a public da'wah, that is basically the duty that would fit within فبلسانه. All right, let's go for the other hadith. عن تميم ibn أوس الداري. This is a Palestinian Sahabi, you got to remember this guy. عن تميم بن أوس الداري رضي الله عنه أن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم قال: الدين النصيحة. قلنا: لمن؟ قال: لله ولكتابه ولرسوله ولأئمة المسلمين وعامتهم. So what happened? So Tamim ibn Aws al-Dari, he basically said that the Prophet ﷺ had said, الدين النصيحة. Religion is sincere advice. We said, for whom? He said, for God, his book, his messenger, the leaders of the Muslims, and their common folk. Let's break it down. Not sure the translation is necessarily too clear. Let's look at this. How do we understand this in Arabic? So, ad-din nasiha. What is a nasiha anyways? When we say ad-din nasiha, is it really that deen is an advice? How do we understand this? So, when you're looking at nasiha, yes, certainly advice, but it's also the pure honey that you would get from the beehive. Okay, that's a nasiha. So what are we doing here? So ad-din al-nasiha, that the true practice of faith is when you're really genuine, when you're really pure, when you are really taking the matters from, let's say, the basis of it. And قُلْنَا لِمَنْ. So what does it mean, قُلْنَا لِمَنْ? If we're going to do nasiha, is it really that we're going to go to the Prophet ﷺ and give him advice and tell him, hey, this is what I recommend you doing? No, this isn't what it means. This is how we adhere to something in a genuine way. Okay, so the most important thing that you would adhere to is basically to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in a genuine way. 2, to the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala where you're committed to it. 3, to the Prophet ﷺ where you're taking the principles, the teachings in a way that is serious, in a way that is basically embracing what the Prophet ﷺ's teachings were saying. And number 3, أئمة المسلمين, where you're also embracing أئمة المسلمين وعامتهم, you're part of the Muslim Ummah, you're concerned also about letting the Ummah, the Muslim nation, also get the genuine, sincere advice, sincere embracement, sincere care from you. And therefore, you would recognize that in order for you to be a sincere person, in order for you to be a person of commitment, in order for you to be a person of principle, that there were certain responsibilities. 1, on an individual level, you would practice sincerity, you would practice the commitment, and certainly the religious integrity, and certainly adhere to the Sunnah. And when we're speaking about the public Muslims, that you would recognize that you have a responsibility towards the society at large. Let's see the 67th hadith. عن معقل بن يسار رضي الله عنه قال: سمعت رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يقول: ما من عبد يسترعيه الله رعية يموت يوم يموت وهو غاش لرعيته إلا حرم الله عليه الجنة. How did they translate this one? There's no servant whom God had entrusted with a flock, and who dies on the day he dies while having deceived his flock, except that God will forbid him paradise. Not sure, I don't know. Let me break it down, okay? So any servant of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, يَسْتَرْعِيهِ اللَّهُ رَعِيَّةً. Well, this isn't necessarily talking about a flock or, a flock of birds or a flock of sheep or whatever, but this is actually talking about any responsibility that you are asked to maintain. And this person, probably when death comes to them and they would die while they were not committed to the responsibility that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically ask them to commit to, whether it's their children, whether it's their wife, whether it's their sisters, brothers, parents, etc. So this would be inclusive to any type of responsibility. I know this would be, explained as metaphorical, but this in Lugha Arabiya, it doesn't necessarily come as metaphorical. It is inclusive to meaning any type of a responsibility that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had entrusted you with. If the person is not doing their chores and their tasks towards this responsibility, and if death comes to them, they would die while they had betrayed their responsibility, then in that situation, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would forbid them from entering Jannah. So what does it mean, forbid them from entering Jannah? That means Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will not give them the privilege of entering Jannah. Simple as that. So when we say حرم الله عليه الجنة نسأل الله العفو والعافية, that's actually so scary, because what does it mean to be considerate over a responsibility? It means 5 things. Number 1, if we're talking about deen, you're maintaining the deen, whether it's your husband, your children, your parents, your sisters, your family. Number 2, it's basically the nafs, of course, their health, you're keeping that and maintaining that. Number 3 is mental health. You're also taking consideration of their mental health, and certainly your mental health as well. Number 4 is basically the chastity. So making sure that your children, I guess, they're not probably becoming victims to other people abusing them, or they are also not abusing others. And certainly you're maintaining a number of different securities to make sure that they are secure. Number 5 is basically the finances. So we're talking about money management. If you are responsible to, I guess, bring in income, that's one side. If not, then you have the responsibility. You have the responsibility to make sure that money management is definitely taken in consideration, to make sure that all the previously mentioned deen, nafs, aql, ird are definitely provided in order to make sure that this ra'iyya, this responsibility, is actually maintained in the best way. So yeah, that's what غاش لرعية means. Okay, let's see the hadith number 68. عن أم سلمة رضي الله عنها. Who's Umm Salama, the Prophet's wife? Her name is Hind. Okay, أن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم قال: ستكون أمراء فتعرفون وتنكرون، فمن عرف برئ ومن أنكر سلم، ولكن من رضي وتابع. قالوا أفلا نقاتلهم؟ قال لا ما صلوا. Let's see, there will be rulers whom you will recognize and disapprove of. Whoever recognizes will be absolved, and whoever disapproves will be safe. But whoever is satisfied and follows, they said, should we not fight them? He said, no, as long as they pray. So what does that mean? That there are going to be some rulers that they would recognize that they're doing some wrong things. And of course, you would know them well, at least that you would be capable of identifying that what they're doing is wrong. And of course, if you were capable, man ankara salim, if you were capable of pointing out that whatever wrongdoing these rulers are doing, you were capable of pointing it out, then salim, then you would be basically on Judgment Day not held accountable because you stood up to say the truth. But وَلَكِنْ مَنْ رَضِيَ وَتَابَ. But of course, on the other hand, whoever of course, they're content and just follow and just move on with the situation and basically accept it. What happens? So, of course, the Prophet, the Sahaba, they said, أَفَلَا نُقَاتِلُهُمْ? Should we not fight them? They definitely recognize what they're doing is wrong. And he said, لَا مَا صَلُّوا. No, as long as they pray. I want you to look at this one, because how do we understand that we're supposed to be fighting or going against the rulers that are basically committing injustices? Do we accept these people, or how do we understand? And does this really apply on the rulers that are living today? And I would like to say is number one is that the rulers are living today, whether we're speaking about Sisi or whether we're talking about Bashar al-Assad or whatever we're talking about, they're all not applying Sharia anyway. So in other words, and in fact, they're fighting Islam, whether you're talking about Muhammad ibn Salman or whether you're talking, and of course, you're going to get some people that will come at me and say, okay, you're doing takfir. This isn't doing takfir. This is saying that they are really kafir, okay? You want to call it takfir? Yes, I am saying that these rulers are not necessarily Muslim from the beginning if they are fighting Islam. If they are fighting Islam, which is what they are doing, you cannot call Bashar al-Assad as Muslim just because he stood along next to Hassoun and basically, started praying. If you're killing people just because they were praying, just because they said La ilaha illallah and not La ilaha illa Bashar, then you want to call that Muslim? Absolutely not, because Islam is not only in saying Shahada, Islam is also in practice. A person can commit kufr if they were to basically spread kufr and certainly fight the religion of Islam. And if you are putting the scholars of Islam in prisons just because they are proselytizing Islam and because they're going against the agenda that you are trying to enforce, which is the agenda of taking out Islam. My brother still is in Mecca, and he was doing Umrah. So he was coming from Palestine, going to Umrah, and the head of the team that was basically with him, he started making dua in the Haram for Gaza. He was arrested. Just imagine that. You want to call that as just making dua for Gaza? I'm not here, not holding a rifle, I'm not fighting anybody. I'm just saying, Ya Allah, help the people of Gaza, which actually tells you that, no, this is an agenda that basically fits with the Zionists and what they're trying to do. So when we're looking here, lama sallu, or they would often use the hadith that even if the leader were to flog you on your back and take your money, etc., but this is actually talking about if they were doing it with haqq. They were doing it with haqq. I know, Noura, you're raising your hand. Go ahead, dear.
Oh, sorry. I just wondered, so was there a time in Islamic history where the
Islamic history?
The Muslimin fought people like these rulers? I mean, can you give an example, Yani?
Okay, fair enough. So in Islamic history, many times, definitely, I would say that our imagination of the Khilafah was very utopian. There were many, many wrong practices by these people. Some of them drank, some of them even went as far as like Al-Khalifa Al-Hakim bi Amrillah. He really went far and forbid even women from coming out, let's say, and killed Muslims and non-Muslims in massive numbers. And definitely, we had even Islamic history where we had, especially in Bilad al-Sham, ironically, in Bilad al-Sham, in Egypt, etc., we did have a lot of rulers that collaborated with the Crusaders. So this was there, and I guess the most one that stands out that I would I guess like to emphasize is the part about the Crusaders' time, where you had some leaders literally collaborate with the Crusaders to kill the Muslims. And that's why you had Nuruddin Zinki, you had Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi, who fought these leaders. If we were going to accept such leaders and say, well, they're praying, and not recognize that they are collaborating with the enemy in order to kill the Muslims, then we would be very narrow in our understanding of these texts. So that's why the scholars would explain that we are supposed to be obeying the leaders, and even if they had جلد ظهرك وأخذ مالك, etc., that is بحق. So if we are speaking about maybe the general people committing wrong, and probably the government confiscated the money because they didn't pay perhaps their zakah, or perhaps this person was flogged because they had committed zina, and then in that situation, you cannot necessarily go against the ruler and say, well, they harmed my honor, etc. Why did they do that? I'm going to go fight them. Then in that situation, we would say, no, this leader was acting based on the principles that were put down and laid out in the Quran, to say that this leader was acting in a way as a personal harm or a personal opposition to you. This isn't a personal thing. This is to apply what is in the book. But if the leader is doing injustice, then that's what Islam is all about. Islam is all about teaching the people that injustice is to be stopped, and yet you have to talk against it. This is not whatsoever telling us that we have to be silent about an injustice because we want to make sure that the people are basically under one ruler, and even though this ruler is harming the people, this ruler is being unjust, this ruler is killing, raping, and who knows what this ruler is doing, then to say that the religion tells us to bow down to these rulers and accept injustice, then this person is not understanding the legal maxims, not understanding what Islam is all about. Islam is all about telling you that لا يحب الله الجهر بسوء من القول إلا من ظلم, that we are supposed to stand against injustice, whether that was a ruler or whether that was an individual, that we have to protect the society and make sure that such rulers are abiding by the principles of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Yeah, I feel like that's they try to manipulate the religion, like those governments. They try to manipulate the Muslims, and
right.
yeah.
This whole ideology, which I don't want to go in details, but I'll just it started out with a guy named Aman al-Jami, and another guy basically supported this idea, which is Rabi' al-Madkhali, but they, I guess, came in handy for the different governments, and certainly the governments love them because they would take the text out of the context to basically just say, oh, just accept what the ruler is doing, the leader, even if they were to commit zina on public television, you should be silent about it, and you need to just stay quiet. For sure, the leader knows what he's doing. His wisdom goes beyond that what you can imagine, and you have to accept accept. And of course, even if the leader is collaborating with Zionism, is collaborating with the enemy, is basically working to serve the enemy and not serve the Muslims. And of course, these so-called muftis, they come in and doing service to give a religious halal logo and a halal label on, of course, all the commandments that are basically handed down by Israel, by Zionists, and certainly handed down by the imperialists, regardless of which group that is. And then certainly this is unprecedented to see that some Muslims are so blinded to recognize that not because a person had a beard and a person basically said قال الله وقال رسوله, if they are acting in favor and in interest of the enemy, then in that situation لا طاعة لمخلوق في معصية الخالق. And certainly throughout history, whether we are talking about the story of Ibn Taymiyyah or even the stories of many scholars that Abd al-Qadir al-Jazairi, you list those scholars, al-Khattabi, etc. You're talking about great rulers. There's no way, and even, hey, you can talk about Umar Mukhtar and many other figures. They basically were coming in with a legacy to show us that we have to be awake, alert, and certainly we cannot be naive to just bow down to the enemies, the colonizers. The list goes on, and by seeing puppets that work, puppets that are dressed like, hey, like a Arabi, like a Muslim, etc., that have a Muslim name, and basically working in favor of the kuffar. This is extremely naive, and unfortunately, you will have even scholars that are also acting in that naivety, and certainly putting a halal label and a religious description on what is actually acting in favor of Zionism. The list goes on and on. I know there in the surah, the Yahud did in Surah al-Baqarah, certainly. Ustaz Umay, you want to say something, dear? Go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
For this woman Ankara Salim, does that mean, it says here that and whoever disapproved will be safe. That did this to be against the ruler if he is oppressed person, and if you say the truth, you will be in prison.
Well, absolutely. If you say the truth, but Salim, of course, Salima min المسؤولية أمام الله سبحانه وتعالى.
Okay.
So this person will not be held accountable because they said what they were capable of saying. But even though this person might have been imprisoned, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will not hold them accountable. Okay?
Yeah, and this is a complete sentence. ولكن من رضي وتابع.
لكن من رضي وتابع, of course, well, رضي بالواقع, تابع, and of course, they couldn't do what they can do, but they, of course, من رضي وتابع, it's like, okay, there's another group, they're just going to just follow on with the situation. Then in that situation, they responded, well, if this is considered as the last thing that you would do, and they said, well, does that mean and that's why they responded, does that mean we're supposed to be fighting them? He said, لا ما صلوا. So as long as they perform salah / apply sharia, then we're going to basically accept that. But if they oppose sharia, oppose the deen, oppose basically all the Muslim interests and all of that, then in that situation, if this goes beyond an individual aberration to becoming, let's call it a public aberration, then in that situation, this must be stopped.
What about the president if he is Christian, like in Lebanon?
This is not even
ما
a leader.
صلوا.
لا هذا أصلا لا هذا أصلا ما صلوا، هذه صلاة المسلمين أصلا. الحاكم غير المسلم هذا لا طاعة له أصلا.
Okay, أفلا نقاتلهم. So this not we can't يعني apply it on non-Muslim.
Of course, well, the whole thing is about Muslims, but if the leader is not Muslim, the leader and the leaders, of course, there's no wilaya. We don't consider that the authority of a non-Muslim over a Muslim, period.
Where is طاعة ولي الأمر?
وطاعة ولي الأمر إذا كان ولي الأمر أطيعوا الله وأطيعوا الرسول وأولي الأمر منكم.
Is not this president.
ليس منا هذا ولي الأمر النصراني ليس منا.
Yeah, but
أطيعوا الله وأطيعوا الرسول وأولي الأمر منكم، هذا ليس منا، فكيف نطيعه؟
isn't it to respect the law or the constitution as we live in America?
The constitution, if it contradicts, if any piece of it contradicts the religion, nothing goes beyond Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's principles.
So no طاعة.
And this is the common thing that people would think. It's like, oh, I have to abide by the law of the land, even if it goes against the religion. من وين جبتوا هالحكي؟
No, I not mean that.
ما بنفع. كيف؟ لا حتى يكون الدين لله. ما فيش. الدين الله سبحانه وتعالى is beyond all. We don't necessarily take any principle beyond the principles of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Even if it's the law of the land. We respect it as long as it goes in parallel with the religion itself, or at least it doesn't contradict it. But if it contradicts the religion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that would be something that we would have to do our activism to basically bring about justice, to bring about the principles. Even if it's in a non-Muslim country, if you're able to be active to make sure that all these behaviors, LGBT or whatever it is basically stopped, well, do so. Abortion stopped, if you can do so, do your activism. That's part of your da'wah. Even though the society anyways is not even Muslim, do whatever you can, even if we're talking about a society that's not Muslim. What's the evidence? Prophet Lut alayhi salam. He was telling them about the practices, the sexual aberration that they were doing. All right, because it involved that this would later even affect their ability to absorb the aqidah. Okay, and we look at Prophet Shu'aib alayhi salam. Same thing. He was telling them about the of course the way that they were doing in their business, and he was telling them that, hey, what you're doing in business is against the definition of justice of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, etc. So we're seeing that they were emphasizing such aberrations, such wrong practices. Okay, so seeing that, even though we would wish that we could go even farther and talk about Tawheed, but there's no contradiction. Keep going, even if you're talking about...
I really like that explanation that you gave. That's true. Like that would prevent them from absorbing the aqidah.
Absolutely. It would definitely prevent them from absorbing aqidah. That's why Prophet Lut alayhi salam and those prophets, they were emphasizing this, because if you are engaging in wrong practices, your mind is so indulged into that practice that you're not even recognizing what it means to take in the principle. And that's why if you look at the ayat regarding Prophet Lut alayhi salam, he was calling them as musrifun. What is musrif? What does al-israf have to do with here? He was called them musrifin. He was called... Al-israf is supposed to be with money. Al-israf is supposed to be with money, that you're wandering money, But to consider that al-israf is exclusive to money is actually wrong. It's any type of an energy, any type of a power. If you're putting it in the wrong place, that would be israf. Whether it's israf in time. What is israf? Israf, sa, ra, fa, it's basically to exceed in the limit of something. So what were they doing? In the sexual aberration, sexual practices that they were doing, they were basically engaging in putting the effort in where it does not belong. And certainly that would come in with money that where it doesn't belong. That would come in with a social dynamic where it doesn't belong, etc. So that actually comes in as israf. Because what your energy is supposed to be invested in is in bringing prosperity, in bringing justice, in bringing family, in bringing stability. That's where your energy is supposed to be invested in. Whenever any energy, whether it's wealth or whether it's wealth or whether it's physical energy, whatever it is, if it's invested in the wrong place, it's going to be soft. And that takes us to the point that we were talking about, which is, as Muslims, even if you do the practice of activism, whether on university campuses, whether it's in masajid, on the street, I don't know, in your fairs, or going out in different areas on the streets, I don't know, raising, pamphlets or whatever it is, in the middle of the highway, or, well, not the highway, but I guess in the streets, downtown, whatever it is. And whatever you're capable of doing, that's your piece of da'wah, whether it's educating people about, of course, the different social practices, or whether it's educating people about aqeedah. All of that is a form of bringing in, of course, this da'wah. So yes, absolutely. Even voting. Even if we're speaking about voting, by engaging in voting, you are basically pushing towards what is possible to make a change within the society. And that's basically this tide that you can change within the society. And by voting, it goes in the same way. Of course, you're going to have some people tell you, well, by voting, you're accepting the Constitution, you're accepting, etc., all of that, and this is kufr. I would not accept necessarily this narrative, because voting is not necessarily to accept everything that the candidate is basically coming in for. Voting is a way of that ebb and flow. It's a way to push towards a certain tide, towards what, based on our study, what is probably best for the society, whether for the Muslim society or the non-Muslim society. It's a way of doing amr bil ma'ruf wa nahy anil munkar. Voting
the
is
scholars who made those fatwa, they were not living in the society, subhanAllah.
Some are living in the society, but I would say it's a myopic interpretation to not understand how the dynamic of change happens when you decide that you want to be a bystander and you don't want to engage in this. What you're not going to realize is that you being a bystander, it basically means someone else is going to take in effect, in power, to determine a lot of what happens around you. Because you chose to say, oh, I don't want to, because I don't want to get involved. By you not getting involved, it does not mean you're not getting involved. It just means you had chosen to get involved by being silent. And being silent is not considered a non-action. It is an action. You took the action to let those people basically do whatever, and you were just watching it. That is not doing an action. You chose to be silent, meaning you chose to accept. That's what it means. You chose to accept this unfold, and you thought that it basically meant that I'm neutral about this. If the other people later on, they're going to have their words and whatever they had said that they wanted to implement, and they started basically going forward, you are going to be the object of all of this, the subject of all of this. You're going to be the subject of all of this. You can't say, oh, I was just silent. No, you were silent. Guess what happens? You're going to be the subject of all of this. So, in other words, be a main object, be an influencer, be a person to make a change by engaging. Okay, let's go to the other hadith. Okay, here we go. عن عبادة بن صامت رضي الله عنه بايعنا رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم على السمع والطاعة. Okay, بايعنا رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم على السمع والطاعة في منشطنا ومكرهنا وعسرنا ويسرنا وأثرة علينا وأن لا ننازع الأمر أهله. قال إلا أن تروا كفرا بواحا عندكم من الله فيه برهان. يا سلام. What happened? عبادة بن الصامت. عبادة بن الصامت is actually buried right at the doors of Bab al-Asbat in al-Masjid al-Aqsa. My grandfather is buried next to him. I don't know how, but yeah. بايعنا رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. We had made bay'ah, which pledged to the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم على السمع والطاعة, to obey, to listen and obey, whether we are basically active and have the energy to it, or whether it is beyond our capacity, and whether we are going through hardship or ease, or even, of course, when this person is basically favoring others upon us, or basically favoring and practicing favoritism, and that we should not fight this matter and basically the authority from its people unless we would see an obvious disbelief that we would have an evidence from in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So what does that mean? So when we're speaking about, look at this one, على السمع والطاعة في منشطنا ومكرهنا, and this would refer if the person is, let's say, if it's an individual practice right there, and certainly there is probably some injustice that was being practiced, that we would not fight basically the leader if we're speaking about certain practices that are probably not completely just, okay? But if there is a kufr bawah, what is al-kufr al-bawah? Al-kufr al-bawah is if the leader were to practice basically straightforward and obvious disbelief, and we had the evidence basically the scholars, they looked and had scrutinized all of this, and they had seen that there is a kufr bawah, then in that situation, certainly we would have to fight this. And it isn't necessarily because somehow we saw some practices, favoritism, or probably certain ideas that we didn't like, but we're seeing kufr right there. Then in that situation, we have to do whatever it takes to make sure that we are getting, let's say, the matters, the principles of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in practice. عن أبي هريرة رضي الله عنه قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم إن الله لا ينظر إلى صوركم وأموالكم ولكن ينظر إلى قلوبكم وأعمالكم. Now we're going to a completely different subject. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not look at your appearances and nor your wealth, but the Lord Almighty looks at your hearts and your actions. So what does that mean? So when people, of course, racing to of course invest in their appearance or invest in their wealth, and of course in our societies and even the past societies, to express wealth and to express of course a certain social status is basically to invest in power, that I have this much power, therefore to bring in prestige, to bring in honor, etc. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, وَلَكِنْ يَنْظُرُ إِلَىٰ قُلُوبِكُمْ وَأَعْمَالِكُمْ. But the Lord Almighty looks at your hearts / intentions, to religious integrity, and أَعْمَالِكُمْ, and what actions you would invest in. So in other words, if you were to look at this one and look at, maybe we could actually do a little drawing, right? If you were to look at, how do you do this? Hold on. I know that there's a way to do this. Okay, here we go. Let's hope it works. Okay, it doesn't want to. So why doesn't it want to? Anyhow, okay. So when you look at this piece of it, وَلَكِنْ يَنْظُرُ إِلَىٰ قُلُوبِكُمْ. But the Lord Almighty would look at their hearts, and their hearts are basically going to resemble their commitment to the words of the to the commitment of the Lord Almighty. And أعمالكم, implementation. Are you really going to implement the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? So when you look at لا ينظر إلى صوركم, He does not look at your images, does not look at what you would do, and does not look at your appearance and your image and all of that. Then in that situation, that is to tell us that what really deserves an investment is really al-qalb. It's really the heart. It's really purifying our heart and letting go of the idea that is centered around wanting to gain some form of authority, some form of acceptance by the society, but it's actually wanting to gain the acceptance by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's why قلوبكم وأعمالكم. Let's look at the other hadith. عن جرير بن عبد الله رضي الله عنه عن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم أما إنكم الله. Look at this hadith. عن جرير بن عبد الله رضي الله عنه عن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم قال أما إنكم سترون ربكم كما ترون هذا القمر لا تضامون في رؤيته. Oh boy, Ya Allah, just imagine this. أما إنكم سترون ربكم. You will see your Lord as you see this moon. So there was a moon, full moon. The Sahaba were with the Prophet ﷺ, and he was telling them, you see the moon up there? Yes. You could all see it? Yes. And you're not shoving one another to see it? No. So he said, well, the way you are seeing the moon right now is the way that you will see your Lord, exactly the same way, that clear, that obvious, and certainly no need, لا تضامون. What is لا تضامون? You're not shoving one another. You're not somehow pushing one another in order to see Allah. You could all see it. And the moon right there, we don't have to say, move, scoot over, I need to see. No, you're all going to see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. لا تضامون في رؤيته. You will not be, and even though the translation here, you will not be harmed in seeing him. No, that's not what it means. This is a wrong translation. لا تضامون means you will not need to shove or push one another to see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us from amongst those that would see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and give us the reward of seeing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Ameen.
Let's go. Ameen ya Rabbi. Ameen, ameen, ameen. So we will stop right here, or actually wait, I want to stop at hadith number 74. Let's stop at hadith number 74. عن عبد الله بن عمرو بن العاص رضي الله عنهما. Why? Because Amr ibn al-As was Muslim, and his son Abdullah was Muslim too. قال سمعت رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يقول كتب الله مقادير الخلائق قبل أن يخلق السماوات والأرض ب50,000 سنة. that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had decreed all the creations matters. So when we're speaking about when we're speaking about maqadir, whether we're speaking about the rizq, the provisions, we're speaking about the lifespan, or whether we're speaking about shaqi, sa'id, they're going to go to heaven, they're going to go to hell. So just different details about their life before the heavens and the earth were created by 50,000 years. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows everything about you before you were even created, and before, in fact, the heavens and the earth were created by 50,000 years. So wait a minute, does that actually mean that if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had known everything and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decreed everything, so why should I do anything? Because He had decreed it, so I'll be okay. No. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decreed even what your intention is going to be. It doesn't mean that He forced you to be like that. He gave you the free will, but because He is the Lord Almighty, who's not confined in time, that's why the Lord Almighty knows the past and the future in the same way. Because time is not confining Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And therefore, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would know the past and the future even before the heavens and the earth were even created. But He gave you the free will. So you cannot say, well, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted me to be a believer, He would have decreed that I would become a believer. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَالَّذِينَ جَاهَدُوا فِينَا لَنَهْدِيَنَّهُمْ سُبُلَنَا. Those that would do jihad, they will eventually and inevitably find basically the path to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You invest to look and search for the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and you will find it. It's there. The path of Allah is there. It's that, do you want to decide and take the choice to take the path? If you do decide to take the path, you're going to see the doors open. The path is there. It's that, do you want to take the path or not? If you don't want to take the path, then you're the one that decided to let go and turn your back against the path. The path itself, al-haq, is there. Let's go for the other one. عن أبي هريرة رضي الله عنه قال قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم من يريد الله به خيرا يصب منه, or يصب منه. What does that mean? Whoever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala intends good for him, He afflicts him with it. So in other words, if you want good, well, you basically seek it, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give you the good. You just have to invest in it. عن أبي هريرة رضي الله عنهما أن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم قال ما يصيب المسلم من نصب ولا وصب ولا هم ولا حزن ولا أذى ولا غم حتى الشوكة يشاكها إلا كفر الله بها من خطاياه. Now that's going to be the last hadith. No fatigue, illness, worry, grief, harm, or distress befalls a Muslim, even if it were the prick he receives from a thorn, but that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will expiate some of his sins of it. That's a great translation right there. In other words, whatever hardship the person goes through, whether we're speaking about an illness, hardship, sorrow, and perhaps sadness, well, every single pain, hardship that a person might pass through, even if that was a thorn that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would remove from the sins off of this person, if they were patient. Now, this is important to keep in mind. So no hardship that you would go through is necessarily going to be basically as the everlasting pain. Some of that pain will basically be a sin remover if you were patient about it. Well, what does it mean to be patient? What it means to be patient is not to complain. That's number one. Number two, what it means to be patient is to continue living the principle of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In other words, continue being steadfast on the principle of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Don't change your commitment because of the hardship. That's what it means to be patient. One, not to complain. Two, to stay committed. And three is to move on, living the hope. That's what it means to have patience. What does it mean to move on, living the hope? So that you don't let your focus be on the pain, but you recognize that you have to invest to basically look ahead in hope and invest that I'm going to do whatever it takes, whether it's treatment to basically bring health, or whether it's to study to probably pass, or whether it's probably doing the effort that is required for me to get out of the situation. So it's three things. Number one is not complaining. Two is living the principle. Three is looking ahead to making a change and not just looking in the area of where the place of pain is, whether we're speaking about illness, or whether we're speaking about anxiety, or whether we're speaking about hardship, that you're not just focused on the hardship, but you're focused on the hope. You're not just focused on the pain, but you're focused on the treatment. You're not just focused on whatever challenge is out there and complaining about it, but you're focused on, well, this is what I want to do in order to change it. And that's why the Prophet ﷺ was telling us, حتى الشوكة يشاك وإلا كفر الله بها من خطايا. Even if it's a prick of a thorn, this Muslim is recognizing that I don't want to just focus on the thorn that pricked me, but I would like to focus that my sins are going to be removed. So that's what it means. You want me to go in details with 73? Inshallah, but I actually have to go right now. I'll do that inshallah next week, inshallah. Next week I'll be doing the moving.
Is it do we have this these hadith in the class?
Yes, document? We do. Yes.
Oh, the same. Okay. Jazakallah khair.
Yes, we do. Okay, وإياكم. So we'll see you all inshallah. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نستغفرك ونتوب إليك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت